It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, a getaway from the stress of work and the chaos of life. Packed my gear, loaded the truck, and headed to a remote lake in northern Minnesota, far away from the noise of civilization. The sound of the tires crushing against the snow and the back roads was the only thing that kept me company as I drove deeper into the wilderness. The towering trees seemed to close in on the road, their black branches swaying in the gust of a wind that whispered through the forest, carrying secrets I wasn't prepared to hear. Before I left, though, I stopped by a bait shop on the edge of town to stock up on supplies. The place was old, with faded signs and dusty shelves, but the owner seemed friendly enough. A grizzled man in his 60s who looked like he'd spent most of his life outdoors. His face was roughened by decades of wind and sun, and his hand, thick with calluses, moved slowly but steadily as he prepared my bait. "You're headed up to Coldwater Lake?" he asked, handing me a bundle of waxworm. "Yeah," I replied, trying to match his casual tone, though a knot of unease has begun to form in my stomach. He paused for a moment. His withered face tightened as if weighing the words carefully. "Be careful out there. It's not just the cold you've got to watch for." I chuckled nervously, brushing off the comment. "What do you mean?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Strange things happen up there. People hear sounds, see things. It's not just the wind or the animals, it's something else." He stared into my eyes, his gaze intense and filled with an unspoken warning. "Folks around here don't like to talk about it, but you do well to keep your eyes open, your fire burning, and never stray too far from your shelter." I felt the air on the back of my neck stand up, but I brushed it off with a half-hearted laugh. "Thanks for the tip," I said, though the feeling was unease lingered in the pit of my stomach. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the look in his eyes, something between fear and pity. It stayed with me during the long drive to the lake, creeping into my thoughts like a shadow. The further I went, the more isolated the road became. The world outside seemed to shrink, the forest pressing on me from every side. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The locals had warned me about the weather. They said the cold could seep into your bones and never leave, that the land itself seemed to freeze your soul. But I wasn't worried. I'd ice fished before, a dozen times before, and I thought I knew the dangers. The stories were just that, stories. I arrived at Coldwater Lake as dusk was beginning to fall, the sky painted in muted shade of purple and gray. The lake lay before me, a vast, frozen sheet of white, its surface smooth like glass. Pine trees encircled the lake, their dark silhouette towering like silent sentinels. There was no sign of any other people. It was just me and the quiet, vast emptiness. It set up my tent in the middle of the lake, the silence almost oppressive around me, and drilled a hole in the ice. The air was biting, and my breath hung in the air like a cloud of steam. I settled in my tent, cradling a cup of steaming coffee in my hands, and settled in for what I hoped would be a peaceful day of fishing. The rhythmic motion of jigging the lines calmed my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I would glance up from my hole, scanning the horizon, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet something felt off. like a land itself was holding its breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted, and the stillness of the lake became unnerving. There was no wind, no sound, just silence. It was as if the world had been put on mute. The trees, the ice, the distant mountains, all were swallowed by an unnatural quiet. The cold pressed in on me, creeping under my layers, sinking into my bones. My breath fogged the air, and my hands trembled, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something else. That's when I heard it, a faint, distant scream. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or a cry of an owl. It was human, but not quite. A wail that carried pain, hunger, and something primal. It sent a chill through my spine, and I froze, my heart pounding into my chest. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the sound. It came again, closer this time, echoing across the icy expanse. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively reached for my flashlight, scanning the surrounding forest. There was nothing. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. Then, the ice beneath me groaned and cracked, a sound every ice fisherman fears. But this wasn't the natural settling of the ice. No, this felt different. It was purposeful. Something massive was moving beneath me. Panic set in. I grabbed my gear, stuffing it into my bag, frantic urgency, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip the pack. I scanned the lake with my flashlight, searching for any signs of movement, my breath coming in short, ragged, burst, and then I saw it, at the edge of the trees, standing just within the shadows, was a figure, tall and impossibly thin. His eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, piercing through the blackness and locking on to me. Its antlers jutted from its head, twisted and jagged, like the broken branch of a long dead tree. Its skeletal face was stretched into a horrific grin, its lips pulling back to reveal jagged, yellow teeth. It stepped into the ice with an unnatural grace, its long clawed hands dragged against the surface. The scream came again, but this time it was inside my head, a deafening roar that filled my mind with an image of starvation, death, and despair. I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs felt like they were made of stone. The creature moved closer, its body convulsing, as if it's struggling to contain itself. I could hear the soft scrape of its claws against the ice, the wet guttural sound it made as it approaches. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping even further, as if the creature itself was draining the warmth from the world around me. Its teeth gnashed together in anticipation, the sound like the scraping of metal on bones. And then it stopped, tilted his head, its eyes never leaving mine, and let out a loud, guttural hiss. Then sent chills down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. Without thinking, I grabbed the propane heater beside me and hurled it towards the beast. The flames erupted on impact, sending a shock of heat into the air. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound so inhuman and agonizing that I thought my eardrums would burst. The ice cracked beneath it as the creature stumbled back, its limbs twitching violently. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. My boots pounded against the ice as I sprinted for my truck, heart racing, breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the creature's shriek echoed through the night. mingling with the sound of cracking ice. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence like an oppressive weight on my back. When I finally reached the truck, I threw open the door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for the keys, and I didn't stop to gather my things. I sped away, my tires skidding on the ice covered road, my breath coming in sharp, panic bursts. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw the outline of something, something tall and thin, standing in the distance, watching me. But when I looked again, there was nothing, just the empty stretch of the road, the forest closing in around me. The lake was empty, but I swear I could still hear the faint echo of that scream, following me through the night. It has never stopped. I haven't gone ice fishing since, and when people ask why, I just tell them the truth. There's something out there in the cold, something that doesn't belong in this world, and it's hungry. Tom Harris loved the outdoors. A seasoned hunter, he saw it as the perfect way to bond with his 16-year-old son, Jake, who spent too much time with his nose buried in his phone. So when Tom suggested a weekend hunting trip deep in the northern Minnesota wilderness, Jake agreed. Their destination was a remote hunting cabin near Cass Lake. Tom found the listing through an old colleague, and it promised isolation and plentiful game. But as they neared the turnoff for the cabin, the paved road gave way to gravel, and the towering trees seemed to close in around them. It was then that they spotted him, a man walking along the side of the road, hunched under the weight of a large pack. His clothes were torn and dirty, his hair matted. Tom slowed the truck. "Need a ride?" Tom called, leaning out the window. The man didn't answer right away. He stared at him with wild, bloodshot eyes. Then he shook his head. "Turn back," he said hoarsely. "This place isn't safe." Jake shifted uncomfortable. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "What does he mean?" Tom gave the man a polite nod and drove on. "Just some local crackpot," he murmured. "Don't let him get to you." Jake wasn't convinced. He kept glancing back at the man who stood watching them until they turned a corner and lost sight of him. The cabin was as rustic as advertised, more shed than house. Its roof sagged under the weight of the years, and moss clung to its wooden walls. Tom seemed unfazed, but Jake felt uneasy. As they unloaded their gear, Jake noticed scratches on the doorframe, deep gouges, like something with claws had tried to get in. "Probably a bear," Tom said when Jake pointed it out. Inside, the air was stale, and furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. A single mountain deer head hung on the wall, its glassy eyes seeming to follow them. "Home sweet home," Tom said with a grin. The first day passed uneventfully. They scouted the area, set up hunting spots, and enjoyed a quiet evening by the fire. But as the sun dipped below the treetops, the trees grew unnervingly silent. Around midnight, Jake was jolted away by a noise, a faint scratching at the cabin walls. At first, he thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind, but the sound moved, circling the cabin. "Dad," Jake whispered, shaking his father awake. Tom grabbed his rifle and went to the window. The moonlight illuminated the clearing outside, but there was nothing there. "It's nothing," Tom said, though his grip on the rifle tightened. "Go back to sleep." But sleep didn't come easily. The scratching continued, faint and deliberate, until the first light of dawn. The next morning, Tom and Jake drove into the small town nearby to pick some extra supplies. At the general store, the clerk, an An older man with deep-set eyes and a voice as rough as gravel watched them intently as they browsed. "You two up at cabin near Cass Lake?" he asked as Tom placed a box of ammunition and a bag of jerky on the counter. "Yeah," Tom replied. "Why?" The clerk expression darkened. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You watch yourself out there. That forest ain't right. People vanish, animals get torn to pieces. Locals won't step foot there, and there's a reason for it." Tom chuckled nervously. "We'll be fine. I've been hunting for years." The clerk didn't laugh. "You see or hear anything strange, don't run. Don't turn your back. And keep a fire going all night. You understand me?" Jake stared at the man, unnerved by the intensity of his voice. "Why?" The clerk's gaze shifted to Jake. "Fire keeps it at bay," he says. "It doesn't like the light." Tom waved him off with a forced grin, but Jake notices his father's hands lingered on the box of matches as they left the store. That evening, while setting traps in the forest, they found something unsettling: a mutilated deer carcass. Its body was twisted unnaturally, and deep gashes marred its sides. Around it, the ground was littered with bones, some cracked open as if for the marrow. "Bears don't do this," Jake said, his voice shaky. Tom didn't respond. He was staring at the ground and the footprints leading away from the carcass. They were huge, almost human, but elongated, with claw-like toes. "We're heading back," Tom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. That night, the scratching returns, louder and more insistent. Then came a low, guttural growl that made the air on Jake's neck stand on end. Tom barricaded the door and piled the wood into the fireplace, stoking the flames until they roared. "They hate fire," Tom muttered, more to himself than to Jake. His expression was grim, his confidence of earlier in the day replaced by fear. Suddenly, a voice called out from the darkness.
"Me, please."
Jake froze, his heart hammering in his chest. It was the man from the road. His voice cracked with desperation, just as it had when he warned them to turn back. Jake grabbed his father's arm. "Dad, it's him. He's out there." Tom's grip on his rifle tightened. He moved closer to the window, peering into the pitch-black night. For a moment, he hesitated, the familiar voice pulling at him. Maybe it was the man. Maybe he needed help. The voice came again.
"Help me."
It sounded wrong, distorted, stretched, like something was desperately trying to imitate human speech but failing. Tom's face tightened, and he stepped back from the window, his voice low but firm. "That's not him." Jake turned to him, confused. "How do you know?" Tom's eyes narrowed. "It's not human. The way it twisted the words, it's not right." The voice came again, even more desperate, but still distorted. Tom grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him away from the window. "If we open that door, we're dead." By dawn, the Wendigo was gone, but its presence lingered in the claw marks etched into the cabin walls and the overturned furniture. Tom and Jake packed quickly, abandoning the trip. As they drove away, Jake glanced back and thought he saw something standing at the edge of the trees, watching them. When they reached down, they found the same man from the road sitting on the porch of the general store. He looked at them and smiled faintly. "Now you know," he said. Tom didn't respond. He just drove, his knuckle white on the steering wheel. Jake stared out the window in silence. The image of glowing eyes and twisted figure burned into his mind. Whatever had stalked them into those woods wasn't just a story. It was real. They never spoke of the trip again, but on quiet nights, when the wind howled outside, Jake would sit by the fire watching the flames flicker and dance, and wonder if the Wendigo was still out there, waiting